Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, stranger corner of history.
Go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. And let your mind soften into that half-sleepy state where things blur together. Because we're about to talk about the time when Europeans, from wealthy nobles to everyday patients, thought the best medicine was ground up, powdered human remains.
Yes, mummy dust.
Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech.
Literal, ancient, dried out bodies, scraped from Egyptian tombs, packaged neatly, and sprinkled into your wine goblet like an herbal supplement.
The Renaissance, after all, was a time of rediscovery of Greek learning, of Roman architecture, of Egyptian corpses. Europe was cracking open the tombs of the past, and rather than standing respectfully at the threshold, they decided to eat what they found inside.
It was thought to be medicine, but also something else, a direct infusion of the vitality of the ancients. If you were feeling weak, why not absorb a little pharaoh?
That was the logic.
And so begins one of the most quietly grotesque chapters of early modern healthcare. Let's drift into the scene.
Picture a wealthy Renaissance apothecary shop. Shelves of herbs, jars of roots, powders, tinctures, oils.
And among them, a small container marked Mumia Vera, genuine mummy.
The shopkeeper would assure you that it came from Egypt, that it was the dried flesh of kings and priests, harvested on the desert sands, imbued with medicinal virtue.
Patients bought it by the ounce.
Surgeons packed wounds with it.
Even kings turned it into their wine, a rather unsettling communion with the past.
The idea wasn't entirely new.
Medieval medicine had long been obsessed with sympathetic cures. Things that resembled ailments were thought to cure them.
Dried blood, powdered skull, even fresh fat from executed criminals were all recommended in certain treatises. But the Renaissance obsession with mummy dust had a flair of exoticism. Imported corpses seemed more potent, more mysterious than your local handman.
There's a certain irony here. These were the same scholars and nobles who were copying Plato and praising the dignity of antiquity, while simultaneously chewing on what they dug up. Humanism in the library, cannibalism in the pharmacy.
The trade in mummies was, naturally, brisk.
Tomb raiders in Egypt discovered they could earn a good living supplying Europeans.
They tore into pyramids and burial pits, dragging out embalmed bodies, scraping resin, crumbling dried flesh, and shipping it across the Mediterranean. By the 1500s, demand was so great that counterfeiters entered the market. Not enough real mummies to go around? No problem. Just bake a recently deceased beggar in tar and pitch, dry him out, and boil instant medicine.
Apothecaries sold fake mummies alongside the real ones.
One physician, more honest than most, admitted he couldn't always tell the difference. Doctors recommended mummy dust for nearly everything.
Headaches, stomachaches, nosebleeds, bruises. If you fainted, mummy dust in your drink was supposed to revive you.
If you had an open wound, packing it with ground-up flesh was thought to help clotting.
It was essentially treated as a cure-all, like aspirin, if aspirin had the added side effect of making you complicit in ancient grave robbing.
Royalty, naturally, embraced it. Francis I of France, nicknamed the father of letters, was also known for carrying a pouch of powdered mummy everywhere he went.
He'd take it preemptively, as if ancient embalming resin was a daily vitamin.
One chronicler says he believed it would protect him from poisoning.
Imagine a king, writing poetry with one hand, and with the other, spooning dried pharaoh into his goblet.
And yet, not everyone was convinced. Some physicians grumbled that it didn't work.
Ambroise Parr, the famous French surgeon, dismissed it as nonsense and cruelty, pointing out the obvious fact that embalmed flesh was unlikely to cure anything.
But his voice was a minority. The fashion persisted. When something feels exotic and promises vitality, logic rarely wins. What's striking is how long this endured.
For centuries, from the 1400s through the 1700s, Europeans consumed mummies as casually as they consumed spices. Apothecary records from Germany, France, and Italy list mumia right alongside cinnamon, myrrh, and saffron.
Some recipes combined them.
Imagine mulled wine with clove, nutmeg, and a dash of powdered priest.
A strange holiday beverage. This practice also intersected with another Renaissance obsession, the hunt for the elixir of life. Alchemists sought a substance that could prolong youth, banish illness, and delay death. Mummy dust fit neatly into that desire. After all, these bodies had survived intact for millennia. Surely, the logic went, there was power in that preservation.
If it kept flesh from rotting in the desert, perhaps it could keep flesh from rotting inside you.
But of course, the effect was psychological, not medicinal. The real result was cultural.
Europeans developed a peculiar relationship with death, treating the remains of ancient civilizations as consumables.
In some ways, it was a quiet cannibalism, disguised in the polite robes of medicine.
Let's drift a little further.
Imagine being an Egyptian peasant in the 16th century, watching European merchants carting away corpses by the boatload.
To the locals, these were sacred ancestors, or at least historical relics.
To the foreigners, they were commodities.
A dried-up king was no different from a spice jar.
Entire tombs were emptied, leaving archaeology impoverished. Also, a French noble could sprinkle a little more dust in his drink. The strangeness deepens when we consider that this wasn't limited to the dead of distant lands.
Europeans also prescribed corpse medicine from their own freshly executed criminals.
A common belief held that the life force of the hanged man, still warm, was potent. Blood was collected from scaffolds.
Fat was rendered into ointments. Skulls were ground into powders. In one grisly ritual, epileptics were said to drink warm blood directly from the severed head of an executed man. By comparison, mummy dust seems almost genteel.
Royal physicians weren't exempt from this grisly trade. In England, recipes survive instructing doctors to mix powdered skull with chocolate to treat bleeding. In Germany, the Elector of Saxony was dosed with mummy tincture for various ailments. Even the well-educated, even the skeptical, couldn't resist the allure.
There's something about swallowing a piece of history literally that felt like partaking in eternity. Naturally, the supply chains grew shady.
Traders in Egypt began looting not just ancient tombs, but recent cemeteries.
They dry out local corpses, pack them with bitumen, and sell them to eager Europeans. One Venetian traveler admitted he couldn't tell whether the bodies he purchased were ancient or only a few weeks old. Customers meanwhile reassured themselves with labels: true mummy, authentic Egyptian, but the truth was that no one could really know.
The black market in bodies was simply too profitable to resist.
By the 18th century, the practice began to fade, as medicine slowly edged away from superstition.
Doctors turned toward anatomy, chemistry, and observation.
Enlightenment thinkers mocked the idea that embalmed flesh had healing powers.
Voltaire scoffed at it. Still, traces lingered.
Apothecaries continued to stock mumia in some corners of Europe well into the 1800s, though by then it was more curiosity than cure.
Looking back, the whole episode is a reminder that the line between reverence and consumption is thin. The Renaissance admired antiquity, but also ingested it.
They revered the wisdom of the ancients, while gnawing quite literally on their remains.
It's easy to laugh at now, but the instinct behind it is familiar. People today still hunt for miracle supplements, exotic powders, ancient tonics.
Substitute collagen peptides or imported maca root, and the pattern isn't so different.
Only now, thankfully, our powders don't come with the faint aftertaste of embalming resin.
As we let this story settle, it's worth noting the irony. Egyptian embalmers had meant to preserve bodies for eternity.
Instead, their handiwork was pulverized into medicine and scattered into the bloodstream of Europe. Pharaohs intended to outlast time, but instead became dust in someone else's cup.
That is history, endless, unpredictable recycling. Let's drift over then to the next royal fiasco, another corner of history where noble lives bent themselves into peculiar shapes. Because if kings weren't chewing on mummies, they were often ruining their bloodlines through other means, marrying cousins, marrying nieces, and marrying until their family trees resembled more of a wreath.
So,
we've left behind the apothecary shelves and their jars of powdered pharaohs, and we're moving into an equally unsettling cabinet of curiosities. Royal bloodlines, specifically, the ones that became so twisted, so hopelessly entangled, that by the end they were less like trees and more like vines strangling themselves.
Royal inbreeding wasn't an accident, it was a strategy.
Dynasties married within their own families to keep wealth and power tightly bound. A king didn't want his daughter marrying into some minor lord's household. He wanted her married to her cousin, the king of the next kingdom over. Conveniently, that cousin often shared about half of her DNA.
It was considered safe, politically speaking. Genetically speaking, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Europe produced some truly baroque examples. Let's drift through a few of them, beginning with the family that has become the very caricature of inbreeding, the Habsburgs.
The Habsburg dynasty dominated Europe for centuries, ruling Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and more. They were ambitious, wealthy, and unfortunately quite determined to keep their marriage pool very small.
By the 1500s and 1600s, their family tree was practically folding in on itself. The result was something known even in their own time as the Habsburg jaw, a jutting lower lip, elongated chin, and a tendency toward drooling hardly the regal image their portraits were meant to convey.
The most infamous case was Charles II of Spain.
Born in 1661, he inherited not just the Spanish crown, but the entire genetic debt of centuries of intermarriage.
He was the son of an uncle-niece pairing already a shaky start. By the time of his birth, his family's coefficient of inbreeding, a term used by geneticists to measure how related one's parents are, was higher than if he'd been the child of siblings.
Yes, higher than that. The poor man never stood a chance. He was described by contemporaries as weak, sickly, unable to chew properly, and prone to epileptic fits. One court chronicler put it bluntly: he was feeble-minded, epileptic, impotent, and short-lived, not the kind of royal son that inspires confidence. And yet he reigned until 1700, when his death without an heir plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession.
A vast, bloody conflict triggered by a man who could barely eat without assistance. And here's where the sardonic part of history creeps in. The Habsburgs thought they were preserving their dynasty.
By marrying within their family, they imagined themselves as a closed circle of power, untouchable.
Instead, they slowly eroded their bloodline until their last heir was practically a tragic punchline.
The Habsburgs weren't alone, of course. Across the continent, dynasties treated the gene pool like a shallow fountain and kept wading back in. The Ptolemies of ancient Egypt, yes. The same Egypt whose corpses were later ground up into medicine were notorious for brother-sister marriages.
Cleopatra herself was the product of such unions, though she was clever enough to distract everyone with charisma and politics. Back in Europe, the British royals had their share of genetic entanglements too, though they managed to avoid the most grotesque outcomes. The House of Stuart, for instance, intermarried among Scottish and English cousins often enough to keep their family portraits looking more like a series of echoing faces than unique individuals.
Later, Queen Victoria, beloved for her prudish portraits and black dresses, helped spread haemophilia, the so-called royal disease, across Europe. How?
By passing it along to her descendants, who dutifully married other royals, concentrating the condition in multiple dynasties.
Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, the doomed son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, suffered from it, his fragile health playing a quiet but critical role in weakening the Romanov regime before the Russian Revolution.
But let's drift back to the Habsburgs, because their commitment to genetic recycling was truly unmatched.
Charles II wasn't the only casualty. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his father's niece.
His grandparents were double cousins.
Tracing the family tree feels less like genealogy and more like folding a piece of paper until all the names sit on top of each other.
Historians sometimes try to soften the story.
They say, well, it was common practice at the time, and it was.
But the Habsburgs took common practice and treated it like a competitive sport. They believed blood purity equaled divine right.
In reality, it equaled a series of heirs who were frail, infertile, or both.
By the end, it's hard not to view the dynasty as a slow-motion cautionary tale written across generations.
There's a peculiar detail worth noting here.
Portrait artists, whose job was to flatter their royal patrons, struggled with the Habsburg jaw. They had to balance the requirement of dignity with the undeniable fact that their subjects' faces were collapsing into themselves.
Some portraits show chins so exaggerated they border on caricature.
But these were meant as official likenesses. Imagine being immortalized in oils with what amounts to a cartoonish jawline, while the painter mutters under his breath about genetic destiny. It's tempting to laugh, but we should pause to remember that behind every drooping lip and fragile body was a person, often a young one, dragged onto a throne they never asked for, raised in the golden cage of a dynasty's ambition.
Charles II, despite being King of Spain, lived much of his life in isolation, treated like a living relic. He was rumored to be bewitched because his condition was so poorly understood.
Priests tried exorcisms, physicians tried endless remedies.
None of it mattered.
His body carried the history of his family's choices, written in his bones.
If the Habsburgs embody the tragic end of inbreeding, the Bourbons of France represent another curious case. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, married his cousin Maria Theresa of Spain.
Their union produced children, but most of them died young, a pattern so common in royal families that courtiers considered it normal.
Infant mortality was, of course, high everywhere, but within royal houses, where the same genes kept colliding, the odds were even worse.
Dynasties obsessed over producing heirs, but their very strategy for doing so often undermined it. And then there is the case of Ferdinand I of Austria, another Habsburg descendant. Born in 1793, he was plagued with hydrocephalus, epilepsy, and what his tutors politely described as limited mental faculties. His most famous line, uttered during a bout of seizures, was, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," a line so simple it became iconic.
Court officials, perhaps to their credit, granted his wish. He reigned officially, though in practice the empire was managed by regents.
Here was another monarch elevated not for his capabilities, but for the simple fact that he was next in a long, knotted line of related heirs. It's worth pausing on the symbolism.
Royalty, for centuries, obsessed over blood.
They believed blue blood, noble blood, was superior, divinely ordained, worth preserving at all costs. They did preserve it, but in the way you preserve a wine bottle that's been left open too long. Eventually, it turns sour. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the very concept of pure blood was being laughed at by scientists who understood genetics far better.
But by then, the damage was already written into the history books and into the jaws and bones of monarchs. The ultimate irony, perhaps, is that the common people, the peasants, farmers, and merchants had healthier, more diverse bloodlines. While they worked the fields, married neighbors, and lived ordinary lives, their rulers were collapsing under the weight of dynastic ambition. A farmer in Spain could chew his bread just fine, while his king, Charles II, commanded soft foods and signed decrees with trembling hands.
So when we look back at the most inbred monarchs in European history, we're not just peering at a gallery of grotesque portraits. We're seeing the unintended consequence of a system built on fear of outsiders, fear of losing power, fear of letting the circle widen. The kings and queens who clung to blood purity became, in a way, prisoners of it. Their bodies told the story more plainly than any chronicler could. And yet, dynasties endured, even weakened, even fragile. They lingered, because power has a strange way of sustaining itself, even when the individuals who embody it are faltering. Thrones outlast doors. Titles outlast bloodlines.
But not forever. Every dynasty ends eventually. Some in revolution, some in quiet decay.
The Habsburgs eventually yielded.
The Romanovs were swept away. The Bourbons were guillotined. The family trees that had been so carefully pruned collapsed under their own weight. As you let that image settle, family trees curling into themselves, branches breaking, it's a good reminder that history isn't just a story of wars and treaties.
It's also a story of biology.
Of marriages, births, and deaths. Of choices made in bedchambers that echoed into parliaments. And sometimes, the fate of nations rested not on brilliant strategy or brave battle, but on the crooked jaw of a king who could barely eat his supper.
Let's drift now, gently, away from royal genetics and into another corner of the past. A place where kings and queens still ruled, but their mistakes weren't written in their DNA, they were written in their daily lives. Petty quarrels, strange habits, and mismanaged courts.
Because royalty may have been fragile, but they were also deeply, wonderfully ridiculous. The official stories of kings and queens are neat on the surface.
They marry suitably noble spouses, produce legitimate heirs, and continue the dynasty like clockwork. But palaces, for all their gold trim and holy anointings, were also very human places. Behind the polished ceremonies lurked affairs, secret marriages, and whispered scandals. And from those came children, royal children who, technically, were not supposed to exist.
What became of them? That depended on the century, the dynasty, and the temperament of the monarch in question.
Some were erased from memory as if they had never been born. Others were quietly acknowledged and given comfortable lives, though always at a distance from the throne.
And some, often the most ambitious, tried to seize power themselves, leaving chaos in their wake. Let's ease into the English example, because the English royals, as usual, produced enough illegitimate offspring to populate a minor city.
Henry I of England, ruling in the 12th century, had perhaps as many as 20 to 25 illegitimate children.
Chroniclers didn't even bother to hide it.
They listed them alongside his legitimate daughter, Empress Matilda, with the casual air of noting household staff.
The difference, of course, was that only Matilda counted when it came to succession. The others were married off to noble families or placed in religious houses. They lived well enough, but their royal blood was carefully fenced off from ambition. Fast forward to the 17th century, and we arrive at Charles II of England.
If Henry I had 20 or so illegitimate children, Charles II made him look positively restrained. Known as the Merry Monarch, Charles filled his court with mistresses and fathered at least a dozen acknowledged illegitimate children, possibly many more unacknowledged. He legitimized none of them, but he did grant them titles, estates, and wealth.
The Dukes of Monmouth, Grafton, St. Albans, and Richmond all descended from Charles's liaisons.
It was as if the royal family tree sprouted an entire hedge of side branches. The most famous of these illegitimate sons was James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. Handsome, charismatic, and ambitious, Monmouth believed he had a claim to the throne.
When Charles II died without legitimate heirs, the crown passed to his brother, James II. But Monmouth launched a rebellion in 1685, declaring himself king. It ended badly. His poorly armed forces were crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor, and Monmouth himself was executed. So there's one answer to what happens when illegitimate royal children try to claim crowns. The axe falls, and quickly.
France offered its own collection of half-royal offspring.
Louis XIV, the same Sun King who made nobles grovel over his stockings, also filled Versailles with mistresses. He acknowledged many of their children, showering them with titles and wealth.
In fact, some of his legitimized offspring became so prominent that they threatened to overshadow legitimate Bourbons. At court, distinctions between true royals and bastards ennobled by the king blurred. The tension lingered, fueling resentment among other nobles who felt these newcomers had no right to such privilege.
In Spain, by contrast, illegitimate children were treated more cautiously. The rigid Catholic monarchy frowned on public acknowledgement of bastards, though kings were not exactly celibate. Rumours abounded, but fewer of those children made it into the record books.
They existed in a shadowy half-light. Everyone at court whispered about them, but official chronicles kept them politely invisible. One curious case comes from Russia. Tsar Peter the Great, already a whirlwind of eccentricities, had numerous affairs.
Some of his illegitimate children were raised quietly within the empire, but one story tells of a boy spirited away abroad, raised anonymously to prevent any succession crisis.
Russia's court was already volatile enough without half-royal teenagers making claims.
What's striking across all these courts is the double standard.
Illegitimate daughters, though numerous, were less threatening. They were usually married off advantageously, sometimes into high nobility, sometimes into foreign courts.
Their prisons could even be politically useful, cementing alliances.
Illegitimate sons, however, were dangerous.
Each one was a potential rival claimant. Each one a potential rallying point for disaffected nobles.
A king might love his bastard sons, but he never fully trusted them. History is littered with examples of those sons testing their luck, and most meeting grim ends. Not all illegitimate royal children were ambitious.
Some seemed content with comfortable sidelines. The Tudor court, for instance, had Henry Fitzroy, son of Henry VIII and his mistress Elizabeth Blount.
Henry VIII openly acknowledged him and even considered legitimizing him at one point. Fitzroy was given lands and titles, but he died young, before he could cause any crisis.
In another timeline, perhaps he might have challenged his half-sisters Mary or Elizabeth for the throne.
But fate solved that problem for Henry VIII.
The tone of scandal shifted with each era. In the medieval period, illegitimate children were almost routine. Chroniclers noted them with a shrug.
By the 18th and 19th centuries, as notions of morality and dynastic respectability tightened, courts tried harder to hide them.
Mistresses were still common, but the children were whisked away to distant estates, raised quietly, sometimes given new names. Royal mistresses themselves occasionally acted as unofficial regents of their little households, ensuring their sons and daughters were educated, polished, and ready for advantageous marriages. And what of the children's own feelings?
That too lingers between the lines. To grow up with royal blood, but be told you will never sit on the throne, must have been a peculiar existence.
Entitled to luxury, yet denied legitimacy.
Close to the crown, but barred by a wall of ceremony and canon law.
Some accepted it and became loyal servants of their half-siblings. Others simmered, waiting for a chance to claim what they felt was theirs.
The court, meanwhile, kept a wary eye, never forgetting that an illegitimate child could destabilize everything. There's a broader irony here. Dynasties obsessed over producing legitimate heirs, and yet illegitimate children were often healthier, more robust, and more numerous. The legitimate heirs born of repeated cousin marriages were sometimes sickly or infertile, while the bastards were vigorous and plentiful. The royal obsession with purity produced fragility.
The side branches, born from affairs, sometimes looked far more like the future. We can see this in the genealogy of modern Europe. Some noble houses today trace their prestige not to legitimate royal marriages, but to illegitimate children who were granted titles and land centuries ago. The shadow line of descent runs quietly parallel to the official one, hidden in plain sight. So what happened to children born in royal courts who weren't supposed to exist?
Some were erased, some were pampered, some were weaponized in politics, and some died trying to seize crowns. Few lived ordinary lives, though some probably longed for exactly that.
In the end, they remind us that royal courts were not pristine machines of succession, but messy households full of human desire. The gilt masks of kings and queens slipped often, and behind them lay the simplest of truths. Rulers had affairs, affairs had consequences, and consequences sometimes cried in royal nurseries.
As this thought drifts into quiet, let's move gently into the next chapter.
If illegitimate children were half-seen ghosts at court, legitimate children carried their own burdens. Sickly from inbreeding, spoiled by luxury, or sad from isolation, they grew up in golden cages.
Their lives, though celebrated in chronicles, were often marked by fragility. Behind the stone walls of castles, past the great halls and the chambers where councils debated, there were always nurseries. The royal nursery was supposed to be a place of joy, filled with the promise of dynasties secured. But the reality of royal childhoods was often anything but joyful.
They were sickly, spoiled, or simply sad-shaped less by love and play than by expectation, illness, and the weight of dynastic pressure. To begin, we need to remember how precarious life was in the Middle Ages.
Disease, poor sanitation, and malnutrition made childhood dangerous for everyone, even those born into palaces. Infant mortality was high, even for royals who had access to the best physicians.
Best, of course, is relative.
These were the same doctors prescribing ground mummy dust or bleeding toddlers with leeches. For royal children, medicine often did more harm than good. Take Edward Vere of England, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour.
Born into immense hope, he was the long-awaited male heir. The boy was sickly from the start. He caught fevers easily, wasted away, and died at just 15. His brief reign was overshadowed by constant illness. His pale, thin figure reminded that royal blood did not guarantee health. In fact, it often guaranteed the opposite, thanks to the inbreeding of Europe's dynasties.
France gave us another poignant case in the Dauphins, the heirs to the throne.
Louis XIV, the Sun King, outlived nearly all of his direct heirs. His own son, the Grand Dauphin, was weak and plagued by illness, dying young. The Sun King lived into his 70s, watching generation after generation of his descendants wither.
By the end of his life, the line of succession had been shuffled and reshuffled by childhood deaths so often that France was ruled by great-grandsons rather than sons.
In portraits, the royal nursery looks opulent, but behind the gold trim was the sound of coughing children, their futures slipping away before they began.
Even when children survived infancy, their upbringing was peculiar.
They were smothered with luxury, but starved of affection. In many courts, children were immediately handed over to nurses and tutors. Queens rarely raised their own children, too busy with ceremonial duties, pregnancies, and dynastic politics. bonding between mother and child was minimal. Kings, meanwhile, treated their offspring as chess pieces on the board of Europe, arranging marriages before the children could even speak. A royal childhood was less about growing up than about being prepared to serve the dynasty. Spoiling came in strange forms. In some courts, young princes were treated as semi-divine. Servants bowed to them, nobles addressed them with elaborate titles, and tutors drilled into them the idea of destiny. By the time they were teenagers, many princes genuinely believed themselves superior beings. The results were predictable: arrogance, cruelty, and detachment from reality. When you've spent your life having people kneel every time you enter a room, you don't tend to grow into a balanced adult. Yet the opposite extreme existed too. Some royal children were kept in suffocating isolation because heirs were so valuable. Their health was guarded obsessively. They might be confined indoors, denied playmates, fed bland diets, and supervised constantly to prevent accidents. The intention was preservation. The effect was misery. Imagine being a prince with golden toys but forbidden to play freely, surrounded by tutors who reminded you that your life belonged to the dynasty. Maria Theresa of Austria, later the formidable empress, grew up in a court where her every move was scrutinized. Even as a child, she was reminded she would marry for politics, not affection. She dutifully absorbed lessons in etiquette and dynastic duty, but her letters reveal a young girl longing for warmth. That tension never fully left her, even when she wielded power in adulthood. Sometimes the sadness came from being overshadowed by siblings. Royal families often produced spares alongside heirs. The firstborn son was trained to rule. Younger sons and daughters became backups, bargaining chips, or cloistered nuns. Their lives were often aimless, shaped by what the heir did not need. Jealousy simmered. Some younger royals rebelled. Sparking was of succession. Others sank quietly into irrelevance, remembered only in genealogical footnotes. We can't forget the physical toll of inbreeding. By the late medieval and early modern periods, Europe's royal houses were so intermarried that genetic disorders crept steadily into their nurseries. Haemophilia, famously spread by Queen Victoria's descendants, turned minor injuries into life-threatening crises. Habsburg children were born with deformities or weakened immune systems. Some were described as too frail to walk unaided, yet still forced into ceremonial roles to display the continuity of the dynasty. Even when they were healthy, royal children lived under extraordinary pressure. Their play was rarely free. It was performance. At Versailles, the children of Louis XIV were paraded before courtiers, expected to embody grace from the moment they could toddle. Every gesture was politicized. A smile at the wrong person could spark rumors of favoritism. The nursery was not a refuge, but an antechamber to the throne. And then there were the darker fates. Royal children sometimes became pawns in hostage exchanges, or were betrothed absurdly young to cement alliances. A princess of 3 might be promised to a prince of 4, with their futures locked before they learned to read. Some never saw the spouses they were pledged to, dying before the marriage could occur. Others were shipped abroad as teenagers, strangers in foreign courts, expected to represent their homeland with flawless obedience. Childhood was short, sacrificed to dynastic necessity. The saddest truth may be that many royal children were lonely. Surrounded by attendants, yes, but isolated from genuine affection. Their parents were too distant, their siblings too competitive, their friends too carefully chosen. Letters and diaries occasionally break through the facade, revealing young princes and princesses writing of boredom, longing, or despair. They were children raised in palaces, but starved of the freedom most ordinary children enjoyed. What happened to those who grew up under these conditions? Some adapted, becoming competent rulers. Others grew eccentric, cruel, or fragile. History is littered with monarchs who seem oddly detached from reality, and when you look back at their childhoods, the detachment makes sense. Raised as idols or prisoners, they never learned to be human. So the royal nursery was not the golden haven one might imagine. It was a place of fevered nights, rigid tutors, absent parents, and suffocating ceremony. It was where dynastic hopes were cradled and often where they quietly withered. As we drift onward, let's leave the nurseries behind and walk back into the more adult chambers of power, because once those sickly, spoiled, or sad children grew up, they became rulers with peculiar habits,
Their childhoods often blossomed into stranger adult lives, and nowhere does that strangeness show more clearly than in the misguided decisions they made once they sat on thrones. When you picture a king or queen at work, perhaps you imagine them as grand strategists, surveying maps, listening to advisors, and then making bold, wise choices that shape nations.
The reality, more often than not, was that monarchs made decisions guided by ego, superstition, or simple boredom.
Some of these choices were so ill-considered that they toppled dynasties or plunged nations into chaos.
Tonight, we're drifting among those royal missteps, the moments when crowns seem to sit on heads made of wax rather than iron.
Let's start with perhaps the most famous, Louis XVI of France, whose great misstep was to do nothing at all.
When the French Revolution began in 1789, Louis was indecisive, passive, and more interested in tinkering with locks in his workshop than managing a kingdom on the verge of collapse.
While hungry Parisians stormed the Bastille, the king fiddled with trivialities. His diary entry for that day:
a single word, nothing. A note on his failed hunting trip, but unintentionally a perfect summary of his reign. When the monarchy needed clarity, he gave hesitation. When the revolution demanded reform, he vacillated.
Eventually, his crown rolled into the basket of the guillotine. It's a reminder that sometimes the most misguided decision is to make none at all. England offers its own catalogue of questionable royal judgment. Consider King John, the same ruler immortalized as the villain in Robin Hood tales.
John managed to alienate nearly every ally he had. He overtaxed his nobles, lost vast swaths of French territory, and quarrelled endlessly with the church.
His most infamous blunder came when he tried to defy Pope Innocent III over the appointment of an archbishop. The Pope responded by excommunicating him and placing England under interdict, meaning no sacraments, no marriages, no burials, nothing. Imagine an entire kingdom spiritually frozen because their king wanted to win an argument.
By the time John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, it wasn't out of wisdom, it was out of desperation.
Spain, once the grand empire on which the sun never set, provides another example.
In 1588, Philip II decided to launch the Spanish Armada against England.
His reasoning: to punish Elizabeth I for supporting Protestant rebels and to enforce Catholic dominance.
His advisors warned him of the logistical nightmare. The Armada was vast, slow, and poorly supplied.
The English navy, smaller but nimbler, harassed the Spanish ships mercilessly.
Then storms finished what cannons had begun.
The once mighty Armada limped home, half destroyed. Philip blamed the weather, saying, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the wind and waves," which is another way of saying, "My plan was fine."
Reality was the problem.
It was a misjudgment so colossal that it marked the beginning of Spain's long imperial decline.
Some misguided decisions were smaller in scale but rich in irony.
Take Emperor Nero of Rome. Among his many eccentricities, Nero fancied himself a great artist. He forced senators to sit through hours-long poetry recitals and musical performances. Attendance was mandatory. Some accounts claim nobles faked fainting or even feigned death to escape the endless concerts. His obsession with art, paired with his neglect of governance, eroded his credibility.
The Great Fire of Rome in 64 had sealed his reputation, whether or not he truly fiddled while Rome burned. His detachment from crisis made him seem grotesquely out of touch. The Senate eventually declared him a public enemy, and he died in disgrace. In the end, his misguided belief that he was destined for artistic greatness overshadowed his duties as emperor.
Russia, meanwhile, specialized in rulers who turned paranoia into policy.
Tsar Nicholas II, the last Romanov, made one disastrous choice after another.
His decision to personally command Russian forces in World War I, despite having no military experience, proved ruinous. His faith in the mystic Rasputin to guide the royal household undermined public confidence further.
And his refusal to implement meaningful reforms alienated both liberals and conservatives.
By 1917, the empire collapsed under the weight of his poor judgment. Nicholas's decisions weren't malicious so much as stubbornly blind. He clung to the illusion of autocracy while the world around him was shifting irreversibly.
Sometimes the mistakes were wrapped in extravagance.
Take Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. Early in his reign, he suffered bouts of mental illness, sometimes believing he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. During lucid moments, he made calamitous choices. He signed treaties that ceded swaths of France to England, undermining his own dynasty's claims. His court descended into factional squabbles, nobles scheming over a throne occupied by a man who thought he was fragile crystal. Misguided doesn't quite capture it. It was catastrophic fragility masquerading as policy. The Habsburgs, already infamous for their genetic misadventures, also provide us with misguided governance.
Emperor Ferdinand II's decision to enforce Catholic uniformity in his domains helped spark the 30 Years' War, a conflict so destructive that entire regions of Europe were depopulated.
His determination to stamp out Protestantism wasn't born of pragmatic policy, but of religious stubbornness.
The result: decades of bloodshed, famine, and ruin, all because one emperor believed compromise was beneath him. But not all misguided decisions were born of arrogance. Some came from overconfidence in symbolic gestures.
Consider Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, addressing the League of Nations in 1936 after Italy's invasion. He begged for collective action, trusting in the League's principles.
The League wagged its finger, imposed half-hearted sanctions, and did nothing meaningful.
Selassie returned to a conquered country, his faith in international diplomacy painfully misplaced. It was less personal folly than tragic optimism, but misguided nonetheless.
One of the quieter, almost comedic royal blunders came from Christian VII of Denmark in the 18th century. Mentally unstable, he made poor choices routinely, but one stands out.
He placed extraordinary trust in his physician, Johann Struensee, granting him sweeping power.
Struensee, to his credit, introduced progressive reforms abolishing torture, improving education, modernizing law.
But he also began an affair with the Queen. Eventually, the court revolted, Struensee was executed, and the king's trust became a scandal.
Misguided not because the reforms were bad, but because Christian VII couldn't see how handing absolute power to a charismatic doctor who was sleeping with his wife might entail it. The thread tying all these missteps together is the same: the conflation of personal whims with public destiny. Kings and queens weren't merely individuals.
They embodied entire states. So when they indulged their paranoia, their passions, or their boredom, entire nations paid the price. Nero's vanity meant humiliation for Rome.
Louis XVI's hesitation meant revolution for France.
Philip II's overconfidence meant imperial decline for Spain.
What makes these stories strangely soothing, perhaps, is realizing that history isn't moved only by brilliant strategy or heroic courage.
It's also nudged, sometimes shoved by foolishness. Misjudgment, indecision, and vanity leave fingerprints on the centuries.
Thrones trembled not only because of assassins or invaders, but because rulers chose poorly.
As we drift out of this gallery of errors, let's wander back towards something more intimate. Decisions may have wrecked kingdoms, but daily life in royal courts was shaped just as much by personal habits, strange routines, peculiar diets, obsessive rituals. The oddities of monarchs are their own kind of history.
So for our next meander, let's peek into those quirks, where power met eccentricity in ways both comical and unsettling.
When you picture a medieval monk, perhaps you imagine him in a simple robe, quietly chanting psalms, eating plain bread and watery soup, and living a life of humble restraint. That image isn't wrong, it's just not the whole picture. Because behind monastery walls, when the abbot wasn't looking or when loopholes were conveniently exploited, monks often did rather well.
And sometimes very well indeed.
The official rules were strict.
Most monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which prescribed simplicity in food.
No meat from four-legged animals, modest portions, nothing indulgent. Meals were supposed to be humble, taken in silence, accompanied by readings of scripture.
The purpose was spiritual discipline, not culinary pleasure.
But humans are endlessly creative when it comes to food, especially when denied it.
And monks, though holy, were still very human. So the kitchens of Europe's monasteries developed a reputation for loopholes, workarounds, and occasionally outright feasts. One of the most famous loopholes involved fish.
The rule forbade meat, but fish wasn't technically meat, it was from the water, not the land.
This opened the floodgates to every possible variation. Monks ate freshwater fish from ponds they built themselves: carp, pike, eel.
They also enjoyed ocean fish brought inland, salted and preserved. During Lent, when restrictions tightened, fish became the mainstay. sometimes cooked in elaborate sauces. If you picture ascetic monks quietly gnawing on dry crusts, imagine instead a steaming platter of roasted eels seasoned with imported spices. Not quite what Benedict had in mind. And then came the cleverest loophole of all: beavers. Yes, beavers. In some regions, church authorities decided that because beavers lived in water and had scaly tails, they could be classified as fish for dietary purposes.
Which meant that during Lent, monks in parts of Europe could feast on beaver meat guilt-free. The same logic was later applied to capybaras in South America under colonial Catholicism. The line between land and sea blurred whenever the appetite demanded it. Another favorite was the barnacle goose.
Medieval naturalists believed that certain geese didn't hatch from eggs, but grew on trees over water, developing from barnacles.
Since they were thought to come from the sea rather than from land, some clergy argued they weren't meat in the usual sense.
This convenient misunderstanding meant roast goose sometimes appeared on monastery tables during fasting seasons. Again, a fine example of how theology bends when roasted fowl smells good enough.
Monasteries also cultivated vineyards and brewed beer. Wine was central to liturgy, of course, but monks didn't exactly limit it to the altar. French and Italian monasteries became major wine producers, often keeping the best vintages for themselves. In the north, beer was safer than water, so it was brewed in great quantities.
Monastic breweries became so skilled that some, like those of the Trappists, still produce world-renowned ales today.
Originally, beer was categorized as liquid nourishment rather than food, so monks could drink it even during fasts.
Strong beer, rich with calories, quietly replaced the solid meals they were supposed to give up.
Fasting, in other words, was sometimes just drinking your bread instead of chewing it. Bread itself was rarely plain. Monasteries had bakeries producing not only coarse loaves for the poor, but also fine white bread for the monks.
Sweetened breads, honey cakes, and pastries slipped into feast days. Certain abbeys became famous for their kitchens, rivaling noble households.
The stereotype of the skinny, ascetic monk exists in paintings. In practice, many monks were round-bellied, thanks to generous diets and sedentary routines. This wasn't universal, of course.
Some monasteries were genuinely austere, clinging tightly to the rule.
The Cistercians, in particular, tried to strip away excess, eating simple meals of vegetables, beans, and bread.
But even they couldn't resist comfort entirely. Archaeological digs at Cistercian sites often reveal bones of animals they weren't supposed to eat, hidden in kitchen refuse. Rules, it seems, were easier to write than to follow. There's also the question of feast days. The medieval calendar was packed with them, hundreds each year. On feast days, restrictions loosened, and monasteries laid out spreads of meat, cheese, and sweets. A monk might fast solemnly one week, then find himself gorging on roast pork the next.
The rhythm of deprivation and indulgence created a diet less about asceticism and more about cycles of restraint and reward.
Documents from some abbeys even detail complaints from local bishops that monks were eating too lavishly.
In England, inspectors occasionally reported monks consuming venison, beef, and expensive imported spices. In theory, these luxuries were forbidden.
In practice, wealthy monasteries were often indistinguishable from noble households. Hospitality required it. When kings, bishops, or wealthy patrons visited, the monastery was expected to provide feasts. And of course, the monks themselves ate heartily at those same tables. Not all indulgences were so grand. Some were small cheats.
Monks might eat eggs during fasts by calling them non-meat. They might sweeten porridges with honey, or slip butter into vegetable stews. These small acts of bending the rules added up, until the supposed ascetic diet was more indulgent than many peasants could dream of.
Ordinary villagers, living on coarse bread and onions, might look at the monastery and wonder just how holy these brothers really were.
The irony, of course, is that monasteries often justified their diets by claiming their work required it.
We toil for God, they argued, and thus we need strength. Certainly, they worked copying manuscripts, farming lands, brewing beer.
But the justification often sounded like an excuse for a second serving.
Still, we shouldn't imagine monks as hypocrites alone. Their kitchens fed not just themselves, but also the poor at the gate.
Almsgiving was central to monastic life. Many abbeys distributed bread and broth daily to peasants, widows, and orphans. The lavishness of their diets was always balanced at least in part by charitable giving.
A fat monk and a fed peasant often went hand in hand. So, what did monks really eat when nobody was watching?
Fish in endless varieties, beaver tails when they could get them, geese misclassified as barnacles, breads richer than a peasant's dreams, beer thick as stew, and wine flowing as generously as the Psalms. Their lives weren't as austere as the stained glass windows suggest.
They lived within a system of rules. Yes, but also within a system of loopholes.
And no one in history has ever loved loopholes more than a hungry monk.
As we drift away from these cloisters, bellies full and rules bent, we return to the larger picture. History isn't just battles and decrees. It's also the quiet choices made at dinner tables, even in monasteries. And if monks, bound by vows of discipline, still manage to sneak roast goose into their diets, then perhaps it's no surprise that kings and queens behaved as they did. Power and appetite, after all, share the same hunger.
Let's wander next into another dark, peculiar space. Not kitchens this time, but scaffolds and execution grounds.
Because if monks were eating things they shouldn't, executioners were living lives few others could even stomach. And their place in society half-fed, half-needed was its own kind of grim royal tale. Among all the strange figures in history, few were as paradoxical as the executioner. They were indispensable, yet despised.
Essential to justice, yet shunned in daily life. A monarch could issue decrees, but someone had to swing the sword, tighten the rope, or light the pyre.
That someone was the executioner, the man who made royal authority real with blood.
And while kings were painted in gold leaf and velvet, executioners lived in a haze of fear, loathing, and ironically job security.
Let's start with the contradiction.
Executioners held official roles, often appointed directly by city councils or monarchs.
They received salaries, sometimes even housing.
They were, in theory, respected officers of the law, but in practice, society treated them as polluted.
Their hands, quite literally, were bloody. People crossed the street to avoid them.
Priests hesitated to bless them. Some towns forced executioners to live outside the walls, as though their presence might contaminate the air. And yet, their families often held the office for generations. The stigma was so strong that few outsiders wanted the job, so it passed from father to son.
Entire dynasties of executioners existed. Their surnames whispered like curses. It was a profession you didn't choose, you inherited it. Like a dark heirloom.
The daily life of an executioner wasn't limited to swinging axes.
They also acted as torturers, jailers, and even butchers.
In some cities, they had the exclusive right to dispose of animal carcasses or clean streets of filth, tasks no one else wanted.
This gave them a strange monopoly on unpleasant work.
People despised them, but also bought their services.
If you needed a dead horse skinned, or a pig slaughtered, you called the same man who beheaded criminals. Their public role was theatrical.
Executions weren't private affairs. They were spectacles, staged in town squares, designed to remind everyone of royal authority. Executioners became performers of a kind, expected to carry out the act with precision.
A clean stroke of the axe was praised.
A botched one was jeered. Some executioners gained reputations for efficiency, even skill. Others became infamous for clumsy, drawn-out killings that horrified onlookers. One slip of the blade, and the crowd might riot.
It's easy to imagine executioners as grim, silent figures, but records suggest many were surprisingly practical. They negotiated contracts, demanded fees, and maintained tools.
The headsman's sword was not just an instrument of death, but a carefully maintained symbol of his trade.
Some even engraved their blades, as though transforming an implement of terror into a personal badge of office.
But how did they live with it? That's where the strangeness deepens. Executioners were ostracized, yet also strangely envied.
They were feared, but their salaries were steady in a world where famine and war made most jobs uncertain. They lived at the edge of society, both cursed and secure. Some compensated with pride, claiming their office was divinely sanctioned.
Others drowned the burden in alcohol, a stereotype common in accounts of their lives.
And then there were the peculiar privileges. In many towns, executioners had rights to confiscated goods of the condemned.
Some collected clothing, jewelry, even body parts.
Skulls and bones were sold for supposed magical properties.
Fat from executed criminals was rendered into ointments. The executioner, despised though he was, profited from every death. He became a merchant of mortality. One of the most famous executioners in history was Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg.
Remarkably, he kept a diary of his work in the late 1500s and early 1600s.
Over the course of his career, he executed 394 people and tortured hundreds more.
Yet his diary reveals a man who considered himself a professional, almost bureaucratic in his approach. He noted names, crimes, methods, always in a tone of calm detachment. Outside of work, he gardened, raised a family, and attended church.
To him, his gruesome trade was just that, a trade. The horror lay not in his words, but in the ordinariness with which he recorded extraordinary violence. Executioners also had an odd social magnetism.
Criminals sometimes sought their blessings, believing the man who would end their life had unique access to divine mysteries.
Women, strangely, were drawn to them too. Despite or perhaps because of their aura of danger, executioners married and fathered children, continuing the lineage. The paradox deepened, shunned by polite society, yet surrounded by a curious fascination.
Of course, not all executioners were equal.
In France, the royal executioner of Paris, based at the Place de Giavilli, held considerable prestige. He oversaw major state executions, often of nobles or high-profile criminals. His name carried weight, even as people avoided shaking his hand. In smaller towns, the role was more menial, closer to that of a municipal janitor with an axe. But everywhere, the tension remained, hated, necessary, unavoidable.
Their psychological burden is harder to trace. Few left personal accounts besides Schmidt, but folklore and rumor paint them as haunted figures, tormented by their work. Some were said to suffer nightmares, others to grow callous.
Villagers muttered that executioners were cursed, their souls marked for damnation.
Children teased one another with the threat of being touched by the hangman.
And yet, these men lived on, generation after generation, because society needed someone to bear the stain. Perhaps the strangest part of their existence was how they blurred the line between justice and entertainment. Public executions drew crowds like festivals.
Vendors sold food. Parents brought children.
The executioner center stage became both monster and master of ceremonies.
His skill or lack thereof was discussed the next day like a theatrical review. A clean beheading was applauded. A messy one, with repeated strokes, might make him infamous for life.
Imagine living in a world where your reputation rested on how smoothly you could separate head from shoulders.
What makes this story quietly unsettling is how executioners reveal society's contradictions.
People despised them, but also depended on them.
They treated them as untouchable, yet stared eagerly as they worked.
Executioners embodied the darker truth that justice, in practice, required blood, and someone had to wield the blade.
Monarchs and nobles gave the orders, but the executioner carried the weight. So how did they live with their jobs? By compartmentalizing, by inheriting the role as family duty,
by taking pride in precision, by drinking heavily,
by embracing the privileges that came with infamy. They lived with it because they had no other choice. Their existence was both curse and career, burden and inheritance.
As we drift from the scaffold, with its crowds and its shadows, we leave behind the executioner sharpening his blade.
Ahead lies another peculiar chapter in history, not the death that ended lives, but the medicine that promised to extend them. Because executioners weren't the only ones selling strange commodities from the body.
Doctors, as we've seen, prescribed mummy dust.
But they also reached for other remedies equally odd, equally unsettling.
And that quiet gallery of cures might be the strangest chamber of all.
If you were a king, queen, or noble in centuries past, you could expect your physicians to be attentive, loyal, and let's be honest, often utterly baffling in their methods. The history of rural medicine is less about science than about theatre, ritual, and sometimes pure desperation.
Kings might command armies, but when it came to illness, they placed their faith in remedies that ranged from mildly ineffective to spectacularly bizarre.
We've already seen powdered mummies making their way into goblets.
But that was just one delicacy in a veritable feast of oddities. Royal physicians prescribed human blood, ground up gemstones, animal parts, and brews that would make a modern pharmacist faint.
Let's drift slowly through a few of these cures.
Start with a favorite, powdered emeralds.
Yes, emeralds, Physicians in the Middle Ages and Renaissance believed that drinking crushed gemstones could fortify the body and ward off poison.
The logic was simple. Gems were pure, radiant, eternal. Surely their essence, ingested, would confer strength. Monarchs like Charles V of France reportedly swallowed gemstone powders mixed into drinks. Of course, the result was less healing than it was expensive indigestion.
But at least it sparkled on the way down.
Another enduring classic was blood.
Fresh, warm, human blood. Physicians recommended it for ailments like epilepsy. The idea was that vitality flowed in the blood, so ingesting it transferred life force from one body to another. At public executions, some sufferers rushed forward to collect warm blood, drinking it straight from the scaffold. For reals, things were done more discreetly. Goblets of collected blood, presented by physicians with solemn faces. To modern ears, it sounds grotesque, but in an age when medicine lacked antibiotics, people clung to any ritual that promised vigor.
Then there was the king's sweat.
Yes, royals themselves sometimes became medicine. The belief in the royal touch was widespread in medieval and early modern Europe. It was thought that kings and queens, anointed by God, carried healing power in their hands. In France and England, monarchs touched thousands of sufferers of scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, believing the disease would vanish at their command.
Charles II of England reportedly touched more than 90,000 people during his reign. The ritual was as much theatre as medicine, but patients left clutching gold coins, the touch pieces, as proof of their cure. Whether they healed or not was another matter.
Moving back into the physician's cabinet, we find another delight, theriac, a complex compound originally invented in ancient Rome. Theriac was a medical superstar for over a millennium.
It contained dozens of ingredients: spices, herbs, opium, honey, and sometimes bits of viper flesh.
Yes, actual snake. Physicians believed theriac could cure anything: plague, fever, poisoning.
It was so revered that Venetian pharmacies staged public ceremonies to mix it, like a holy event.
Royals hoarded it, sipping it as a universal antidote. Whether it worked is debatable.
What's certain is that the opium content likely made patients feel better about everything, at least temporarily. Animal parts were also in fashion.
Powdered unicorn horn was a favorite, though in practice it was usually narwhal tusk or rhinoceros horn, imported at high cost.
Royals drank from cups said to be carved from unicorn horn, believing it neutralized poison. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, supposedly kept such a cup at her side. To sip from it was to feel protected, though in reality it was just calcium and dentin. Expensive dentin.
Another curious cure was known as drinking the king's broth, not broth made by the king, sadly, but rather concoctions brewed with gold leaf. Physicians insisted gold was incorruptible, so consuming it might lend the same incorruptibility to the body. Gold leaf was ground and mixed into drinks.
Monarchs quite literally swallowed their wealth. Alchemists also promised to create elixirs by dissolving gold in aqua regia, a corrosive acid. The result was less immortality and more severe stomach pain. Royal physicians also leaned heavily on astrology.
Before prescribing, they cast horoscopes. The alignment of planets supposedly determined whether bloodletting should be performed, which herbs would work, or even which days were safest for treatment.
Illness wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. If Mars was ascendant, perhaps a wound would heal more slowly.
If Venus was favorable, a lovesick prince might recover quicker. Thus, medicine became stargazing with a side of leeches.
Speaking of leeches, they deserve their own moment.
Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for almost everything: fevers, headaches, melancholy, even nosebleeds.
The logic was based on the theory of humus blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, too much of one, and disease followed. The cure balanced them by draining blood. Kings endured it with stoic faces, veins opened, leeches attached, while physicians nodded approvingly.
Henry VIII was bled excessively during his later years, which likely worsened his health.
But for physicians, the sight of flowing blood was reassurance that they were doing something.
There's also the peculiar case of the weapon salve in the 17th century. Some physicians claimed wounds could be healed not by treating the patient, but by treating the weapon that caused the injury.
A sword that drew blood could be cleaned, anointed, and blessed, and the wound would heal sympathetically.
It sounds absurd, but nobles swore by it. The idea was that the universe operated on hidden sympathies, strings of connection between objects. Heal the sword, heal the man. And then we come to the quieter, stranger rituals.
For insomnia, royal doctors sometimes recommended placing slices of raw onion by the bedside, or wearing amulets filled with herbs under the pillow.
For fertility, they advised eating animal testicles, reasoning that like cures like.
For gout, they suggested boiling live puppies and applying the broth as a compress. That last one, thankfully, seems to have been rare, but the fact it appears in medical texts at all is a reminder of how desperate people were. What ties all of these together is the combination of faith, symbolism, and performance.
Medicine for royals wasn't just about healing bodies.
It was about reassuring dynasties.
A sick king endangered the realm, so the rituals of medicine carried political weight. Drinking powdered gems or touching thousands of peasants wasn't just healthcare, it was theatre, performed for the stability of nations.
And behind it, all were physicians who straddled the line between science and superstition.
Some genuinely believed in their remedies. Others knew they were offering placebos, but also knew that a confident ritual was often better than nothing.
After all, modern antibiotics were centuries away. Faced with plague, smallpox, or tuberculosis, who wouldn't try unicorn horn if it seemed to help?
Looking back, it's easy to laugh at these remedies.
And yet, the underlying impulse isn't so alien.
Today, people still buy expensive supplements, crystals, and miracle tonics. Powdered emeralds may have fallen out of fashion, but powdered collagen lines store shelves.
Theriac has vanished, but multivitamins promise similar, cure-all benefits. The royal doctor's cabinet, in all its strangeness, is a mirror one that shows us how little humans have changed when it comes to chasing health and hope.
As we drift away from these medicine chests, let's leave the golden cups and leech jars behind. Ahead lies another curiosity, just as strange, but far more colourful, the pageantry of death itself. Because once monarchs and nobles finally succumbed despite all their theriac and gemstone broths, their funerals became spectacles of wealth, fear, and sometimes grotesque theatre. When kings and queens finally died despite the gemstone powders, the leeches, and the endless prayers, their deaths were not allowed to be simple. For ordinary people, death was a quiet burial, a parish priest, perhaps a few candles. For royals, it was spectacle.
The funeral of a monarch was both theatre and propaganda, designed to remind everyone that, even in death, royalty mattered more than anyone else. And sometimes, in their determination to display grandeur, courts stumbled into grotesque absurdities. Let's begin with Louis XIV, the Sun King.
He reigned for 72 years, basking in magnificence at Versailles. But when he died in 1715, the procession revealed the strange contradictions of royal mortality. His funeral was a grand affair, coaches draped in black, thousands of mourners, endless chanting of priests. But his body, embalmed in the crude methods of the time, decayed rapidly in the summer heat. Accounts describe the stench overwhelming the Abbey of St. Denis, forcing mourners to cover their noses.
The man who had demanded endless displays of elegance became, in the end, an olfactory catastrophe.
France, in fact, specialized in these grotesqueries. During the funeral of Charles VIII in 1498, his corpse reportedly swelled so much that the coffin burst open.
The crowd recoiled, yet the priests continued their chanting, determined that the ritual march not falter. Kings might rot before their subjects' eyes, but the ceremony had to continue. England, too, had its share of grim pageantry.
Henry VIII's funeral procession in 1547 was as grand as expected, with tapestries, mourners, and solemn music.
But on the journey to Windsor, the coffin, filled with quicklime to hasten decay, began leaking foul liquids. Chroniclers gleefully recorded that dogs lapped at the spills.
To the pious, it was a sign of divine judgment. To the cynical, it was a reminder that even a king was, in the end, just meat in a box.
Sometimes the grotesque was deliberate. Royal embalming often involved separating body parts.
In medieval France, it was common to bury the heart, entrails, and body in different locations, spreading the presence of the monarch across sacred sites.
Richard the Lionheart's heart was buried in Rouen, his body at Fontevraud, his entrails near where he died. The symbolism was powerful. One king, ruling in multiple places even in death. But the process was grisly. Organs scooped out, salted, and packaged for transport like sacred delicacies. In Spain, The Habsburgs developed their own macabre ritual at the monastery of El Escorial. Royal bodies were interred in a special crypt called a Panti Anilos Reis, but they weren't placed there immediately.
Instead, corpses were left to rot in a chamber known as the rotting room for decades. Attendants monitored the slow decay until only bones remained. Only then were the remains transferred to the final crypt.
Imagine being the monk assigned to check on the slow dissolution of emperors and queens, patiently waiting for history to finish its work.
Russia added another layer of theatrical morbidity.
When Peter the Great died in 1725, his body was displayed in a temporary palace for months, surrounded by candles, and guarded day and night. Visitors filed past the corpse as though attending an eternal reception. It was less a funeral than an extended state performance, as if Peter could still oversee his empire even while embalmed.
Funerals also carried heavy political weight.
The death of a monarch was a dangerous moment, when rivals might challenge succession. So the funeral doubled as a declaration: the crown may pass, but the dynasty remains. This is why funerals were drenched in ritual black-draped horses, processions of clergy, nobles carrying scepters and swords.
The dead king's power was paraded one last time, reassuring the public that monarchy itself was not dead.
But sometimes the rituals backfired. Charles II of Spain, the famously inbred and sickly last Habsburg of his line, died in 1700.
His funeral was meant to be a solemn closure to a dynasty. Instead, it was overshadowed by whispers of his physical deformities, which had made him a symbol of dynastic decay.
The spectacle could not erase the reality. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, plunging Europe into chaos. His coffin was a reminder not of continuity, but of collapse. Even in more recent centuries, royal funerals kept their theatrical oddities.
Queen Victoria in 1901 was buried in white, not black, fulfilling her wish to be dressed like a bride in death. Her coffin was packed with sentimental trinkets, including a plaster cast of Prince Albert's hand and a lock of her servant John Brown's hair.
The funeral was grand. Of course, processions, soldiers, cannon fire, but the intimacy of those objects reminds us that beneath the grandeur, royals clung to personal attachments as much as anyone else. Sometimes the grandeur tipped into absurdity. In 1774, when Louis XV of France died of smallpox, his body decayed so rapidly that his coffin had to be rushed out of Versailles under cover of night, with only a few attendants. The official funeral was delayed, leaving the Sun King's grandson, Louis XVI, to inherit not only the throne, but also the embarrassment of a grandfather who stank too much to bury properly. Royal funerals were as much about the living as the dead. They were staged to impress, to terrify, to reassure.
The black horses, the tolling bells, the endless lines of priests, all of it said, monarchy endures. But the grotesque details, bursting coffins, foul smells, organ charts betrayed the truth that kings, for all their crowns, decayed like everyone else. Perhaps that was the most subversive message of all. Behind the velvet, humanity still rotted. What makes these tales oddly calming, perhaps, is that they reduce the mighty to the mundane.
The Sun King stank. The bloated king's coffin burst.
Dogs lapped at Henry VIII.
The ceremonies continued, but the bodies betrayed the illusion.
History is always two stories at once, the official script and the unscripted mess beneath. As we drift onward, let's leave the crypts behind, the candles guttering low, and the stone slabs sealing shut. Ahead lies one last chamber in our drowsy wander, not death this time, but memory, because royals, in their strange ways, lived on through portraits, myths, and gossip, and those afterlives were often just as peculiar as their real ones.